Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our disaster recovery webinar. This is part 2 of a 3-part series on backups, discovery, disaster recovery, and business continuity. Before we begin, let me cover just a few housekeeping items. We'll keep everyone muted throughout the webinar, so if you have a question, please type it in the chat window and we'll address it at the end as time permits. Dawn is really going to try to keep this under a half hour, but we do want to make sure we answer all of your questions. Now let me introduce you to today's presenter, Don Cockayne. Don has over 30 years of experience managing and supporting businesses just like yours all across the country. And today he's going to dig into that experience as he goes over some of the fundamentals of disaster recovery planning. All right, now it's time. I'm going to turn it over to Don. Hi, Don.
Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for that intro. Thanks for joining us today, everyone. And as Jen promised, we'll try to keep this at 30 minutes or less. We know we're intruding on your lunch hour, so let's jump right into it. As Jennifer mentioned, this is part 2 of what we've put together as a 3-part series of webinars that are kind of all related. So if you missed the previous webinar, which we did about a month ago, just know that if you go to appliedintegration.net, we do have that webinar linked up on the home page. And I would recommend you go back and kind of watch that one after you've gone through this one. And because what we set kind of in that first webinar is we introduced just some of the new technology that is being used for data backup. And we also talked about kind of the planning and making sure that you've addressed the important information on your systems to make sure it's all being backed up properly. And without that kind of step done, what we're going to talk about today can't really come to fruition if we're not sure that we've got everything backed up properly to begin with. In today's webinar, what I'm going to talk about is the considerations that need to be kind of taken into consideration as you think about this plan for recovering from a disaster. When bad things happen, we want to make sure you're prepared to keep the business functioning. And as I said, just going back to that first webinar, if you didn't kind of do the necessary planning for backing up data properly, things get pretty interesting when we get to the point where we have to actually talk about bringing the company back from when something's gone wrong. So as we talk about these disaster recovery considerations, I like to start first of all with the data-related disasters that can happen in a business, because that's the most common. It's not always the most impactful, but it is probably these days the most common kinds of things that can impact us. And whenever I start talking with business owners about disaster recovery, and again, I've been doing this for over 30 years now, and I've been through every kind of disaster you can imagine, from buildings burning down to tornadoes and hurricanes. People do jump to the natural disasters quite frequently as kind of the first thing that they think about when we start talking about planning for disaster recovery. But I'm going to step us back from that a little bit, and I'm going to kind of get a little bit closer to the ground and talk about some of the smaller things that can still have a big impact and can quickly grow into a disaster in terms of how they're going to affect your business. And the first one I like to start with is just a single important file getting deleted or overwritten or in some fashion gone from your system, because people don't always think about this as a disaster. But again, if we think about, let's take an example. I like to use an example, a big Excel spreadsheet that's the annual budget for all the different department heads to have their budget laid out for the year. Typically that's the kind of file that gets put together with a lot of time, a lot of thinking, planning. Maybe you're pulling information in from a lot of various sources and kind of landing that all into one big Excel spreadsheet that everybody's referring back to kind of lay out the budgets for the year. So that's a file in and of itself that can be considered to be pretty darn important. And if accidentally somebody overwrites that file with an Excel spreadsheet of the baseball scores from last week, suddenly the data is gone. And while that may not seem like that big of a deal to begin with, if we start to look at the impact to the business, we could seriously consider that to be a disaster, because all of the information from, let's say, high-level people in the company working diligently over the last, month or 2 months or 3 months or whatever to build up this budget spreadsheet. Now we're talking about what could be considered to be a pretty significant disaster. So whenever we start here, again, if we start with a single file, kind of build ourselves up from here, we do find ourselves kind of answering some of the preliminary questions that have to happen as part of how we would recover from this disaster. And basically what those questions are kind of like, how sure are we that we're going to be able to get that file back in a timely manner? If suddenly everyone's running around going, hey, the budget spreadsheet just got killed, where is the backup for that? And how quickly can we get that restored so we can get back to business? Those are the things that we need to think about and factor into our disaster planning. It's the resolution of that problem is what we call disaster recovery. So you need to know how you're going to recover from that kind of an incident and how quickly you're going to recover from that kind of an incident, because as you answer those two questions, you'll now start to be able to assign a kind of a dollar value to that file or to the disaster recovery planning for that single file getting lost. And as you look at that, you may find that you've got a lot of data that needs to be looked at. And that's perfectly okay. But if we start at this level, kind of getting real granular and kind of go up from there, we're setting ourselves up for a slightly easier way of kind of thinking this process through and planning for it. So if we bump up the ladder one step up from kind of looking at one specific file, now we can start to talk about what happens if we've lost a big block of data. And I'll tell you how this is most commonly happening today. The most timely way I can present this to you is I'm talking about ransomware here, or some other malicious virus that has gotten into your business. Ransomware, in case you have been living under a rock somewhere and you haven't heard about it, is this a virus, a piece of software that's intended to get into your system or systems and encrypt the data, basically make the data unavailable to you. And these applications are written to get all the data. So all of your Word documents, all of your Excel documents, your pictures, you name it, all of that information gets encrypted or scrambled up, and you can't read it. And the idea is that the person who did that is then going to put a message up on your screen going, hey, send me a bunch of money by way of these, anonymous Bitcoins, and I'll send you a key to unencrypt your data and give your data back. So they've basically taken your system hostage and are trying to extort money from you. And when these ransomware events happen, the software that these guys are writing is smart enough to jump from system to system and corrupt a lot of stuff. We found we were working with one mortgage company that the owner of the company clicked on the virus, it started running, it encrypted all the data on his machine. He had a shared drive that was their server, and it immediately jumped over onto that server and started working its way down through the entire structure of that server, encrypting everything as it went. So when this kind of event happens, we can find ourselves in a place where suddenly we've got a huge amount of data that we have to start thinking about that's either corrupted or physically lost, but in most cases it's when I say corrupted, it's encrypted. You can't read it, so for all intents and purposes it's corrupted. And again, as we're thinking about how we're going to recover from that, the worst case scenario is we got to send that criminal the Bitcoins. We don't want to do that because A, that makes them profitable and they keep on doing it, but B, and most importantly, really, is there's no real guarantee you're even going to get the data back if you do send the money. These guys are criminals to begin with, and so there's no reason to believe that they're going to give your stuff back. So we should have another way of looking at this in our recovery plan. We need to be able to look at bringing back into the business huge amounts of data in some cases. And again, if we go back to what we talked about a little bit in our first webinar, as we talked about backup technology and backup data storage, one of the things that we addressed in there was cloud storage and how fast you can get your information back from the cloud. So this is a chunk where, we're just sitting here talking about a great big amount of data is lost, and we got to figure out how to get it back in. And things get pretty interesting if we haven't put the right plan in place to begin with. And of course, there's always the possibility of a physical system crash coming along out of the blue one Saturday or Wednesday afternoon with no warning, when one of your servers goes up in smoke or fails, the hard drive crashes, the power supply blows up, the motherboard goes down, whatever. This stuff is just hardware, and it does break, and it generally breaks without much warning. And so as we're thinking about disasters that can impact our business, one of the things we do have to think about is we kind of, again, step up the ladder of, away from that granular single file thing, is we've got to look at a total system being taken out of service. So let's say that this is our primary file server or our print server or our domain controller that just went up in smoke. That can bring the business to its knees, and we need to be planning for that, and we need to be able to understand, how do we get that machine back? Do we have to run down to Best Buy and buy a new server and try to slam it into place, or do we have a maintenance agreement in place on that physical equipment where we can dispatch a certified technician with parts in his hand to come in and repair it? Your situation is going to be your situation, the life of your servers, the age of them, how critical they are. But I'm just talking about, as we're building out our plan here, these are the things that we need to understand and think about is, okay, well, let's assume, we know what we're going to do if we lose a single file. What do we do if we lose a whole bunch of data? What do we do if that server in the back closet, we walk in there and there's smoke coming out of the back of it? How do we respond to that? So those are the kind of the data-specific problems that we always try to address first of all. And what we're trying to do with these webinar series is really give you some questions that you can go back and find answers to in your business to make sure that you're prepared for this kind of stuff. So I'm going to stop a couple different points during the webinar here and just give you a chance to kind of jot down some of these key questions that you should be able to know the answers to, or the person responsible for managing your infrastructure should be able to give you answers to quickly and confidently. And so as we talk about these data-specific problems, you need to know how you would respond to that budget spreadsheet getting deleted. Or if you're doing a hypothetical, what happens if Mary in accounting clicks on the ransomware and the accounting machine gets corrupted, and then it jumps over onto the server and starts infecting that? How would we respond to that and get our systems back? And that question, when physical hardware blows up, how do you get it fixed? Who is responsible for that? And what's going to happen with that hardware crash? And in most cases, what I want you to be thinking about with the hardware is really, you should have some kind of a hardware maintenance agreement or something in place on that hardware for the mission critical stuff, to make sure that someone is prepared to dispatch and repair it. And in most cases, you're going to have some kind of an agreement on there that sets some time parameters for how fast that will happen. We use a lot of Dell servers, and we can put Dell servers on their mission critical best of breed support agreements, but we still know that the dispatch window, the time that that guy has to be on site, can be as much as 4 hours on their very best plan, and longer on their plans that we spend less money on. And so you have to understand that, if a server does crash, the best effort from your Dell technician may be, several hours before he even gets there to start diagnosing the problem. And then, there may be additional time as he gets hardware in. The other thing that I like to make sure that people do as they're thinking about building out this plan for bringing the business back from a disaster is just answering this question is this all theoretical, or have you actually tested some of these things that we're talking about? Do you know that you could go restore that budget spreadsheet, and have you tried restoring it from last Wednesday to someplace else just to make sure you can get it back? Because if you don't know that, then these plans are hypothetical, and the stress may go through the roof when you find out that the situation is now upon you and boom, something's not working. So plan, but test. Verify that you can do this stuff that you've put in your plan, because without the proper testing, it doesn't matter, what we're planning if we can't actually restore a file when we need to, or we can't bring the whole system back that's crashed. And trust me, I've seen too many companies. The reason I hammer home this testing part is because backup technology hasn't always been bulletproof. There have been days in the past where we thought backups were running just great, and when we tried to go back to them, the data wasn't there or it couldn't be restored. We've thought we knew what the hardware expectations were, and then sometimes we've had vendors who really couldn't step up and deliver what they'd promised. So it is good to know that you've tested some of this stuff to begin with. And again, I'm just trying to prepare you to go back and ask the people responsible in your organization some of these questions. When is the last time we tested some of this stuff? So if we move beyond the data part of system disasters, and we start talking about the things maybe outside of the business that are going to have a huge impact on the business, one of the first ones that kind of everybody can relate to is power outages. In some parts of the country, we have customers that we support out in California, and I know if you've been watching the news over there in California over the last few years, as the drought conditions have gotten worse, the power companies have elected to start to do these rolling blackouts during high wind and low humidity events to try to keep the power lines from arcing and sparking and starting a fire. And so, we go through this periods of time where the power is just out across the board for everybody. And even if you're not affected by that in the part of the country you're in, you might have power outages in the winter with the blizzard, or you might just have, we had a situation just the other day where there was a traffic accident. Two cars hit into each other, and one of them got knocked into a power pole and knocked the power pole down, and there was a localized power outage. So we kind of have to factor the power side of life into our disaster recovery planning, and there's a lot of stuff we can do to mitigate power outages. One of the things that you should do is you should look around your business at your high-value computers and the people that are kind of the most expensive, that are using their computers all the time, and make sure that you've taken those individual workstations and put small battery backups or UPS devices on those computers so that they can survive those short-term power outages. If the lights just blip, go out for a second and come right back on, that stuff is just horrible for computers, because generally the computer maybe doesn't get a chance to shut completely down before the power is trying to turn it back on. And by putting little power backups on each of these individual machines, you kind of smooth out those bumps and valleys and spikes in the power supply. But if we take that a step further, we may find that we as we look at back in our server closet, we may have big battery backups back in there that are designed to actually keep our servers running for 20, 40 minutes, that kind of thing, so that we have time, if the power goes out and it looks like it's going to stay out, to actually perform an orderly shutdown of those computers, which is much better than just slapping them off with no warning. And if you're in an environment where the power does go out a fair amount, or you've decided that the value of those servers is such that you really just don't want to deal with power outages, even if they are long-term, you can build up those battery backup devices and add additional battery capacity to them so that you can calculate, an extended amount of runtime for your servers and your mission-critical devices based off UPSs. And then if you take that one step further, we've seen customers who are in parts of the country where, like I said, in the winter, sometimes a blizzard will be blowing through and they'll be out of power for a day or a day and a half or a couple of days. And in those instances, a lot of customers have resorted to placing their own on-site power generation in place using generators, so that they run for a few minutes off the UPSs in a blip, they run for several hours off the UPSs if the power goes out for an extended period of time, and if it looks like it's going to stay down, they fire up their own generators and run the systems that way. And so, that's how we can take these power disasters and kind of factor those out of our business and get rid of them. Natural disasters are much more difficult to deal with because the scale of them can vary so much. Now, it's interesting, as we're sitting here today having this webinar, we're watching Hurricane Laura approach the Texas and Louisiana coast as either Category 3 or Category 4 hurricane with 20 to 25 foot storm surges coming in, and everybody knows, based on where they're located in the country, what kind of natural disasters they need to be prepared for and how those are going to impact the business. We like to take those and help people understand in their area, they know what the weather events are. So by taking those into account, we can build out the recovery plan that we need to have in place to get back when that event has wrapped up. So with our customers that are in Florida, we know that they've got the routine down to board up the windows when the hurricanes are rolling through, and we shut down all the servers in an orderly fashion. And when the storm moves on and they take the plywood down, then we have a startup plan to kind of bring all the systems back online in an orderly manner and put everything back the way it was, nice and neat. Or if we've got that same kind of an issue where a customer out in the California area, the power company announces the rolling blackouts, we've got the blackout plan in place. We shut down their systems in a fashion that we want to, so that, again, everything's in control. When the power comes back on, and we're sure it's going to stay on, it hasn't just blipped up for a second, then we'll bring everything back in an orderly fashion. So as you look at planning for the natural disasters that your business is affected by, you do want to kind of address both aspects of that. What do we do as the natural disaster is approaching? Because generally today we have warning. And so what do we do to kind of control the situation as we're going into it? And what do we do as it moves on and we bring the system back? Now, again, you've got to look at that yourselves, but almost everybody can be affected by something, no matter where they are. Not everybody's in hurricane territory, we get that, but everybody can have power outages, everybody can have severe wind events that may cause issues. You've got other situations that you need to deal with, and so we just want to look at those as you're building the plan. Now, the COVID-19 lockdowns that are in place and generally kind of moving in and out, there's areas of the country that are mostly back to work. There's areas of the country that are still heavily impacted. This has really taught us all a lot about remote working and factoring that in as a kind of long-term, this has been a long-term sustained business impacting disaster, in that we've had to, at the very beginning, without maybe much of a plan, just pick up all our folks and send them all home overnight and start to struggle our way through getting them remotely connected back in. But as this situation has kind of developed, what we've found is we've now been able to refine our plans for remote workers, and now we can develop recovery plans that ensure that your workers are connected well, can access the business systems they need, and can work as effectively remotely as they could in the office. And if there is any, silver lining to this cloud that we can all take away from this, is I think we'll find that our recovery process, our disaster recovery planning, will be much more robust and much easier to implement because of what we've all gone through with COVID lockdowns and so forth. So we're factoring this into our disaster recovery plans now and going, okay, everybody's in the office this week, but here's what we would do if things change and we had to send everybody remote next week. If someone shows up and didn't know they were infected and is now, put the whole office at risk, and we got to send everybody home for some isolation, how do we keep them effective working through that situation? And one of the things that we've relied on heavily to get that really done well is these new cloud services that can be put into play to give people access to things when they are remote. So not only have we been able to kind of turn on some of these cloud services, but by doing so, we've been able to, better enable those folks to work remotely. And a lot of of what is going into the cloud these days can be, simple stuff like your email hosting is generally done in the cloud these days, so you can get to your email from wherever you are. But it is more and more companies are starting to migrate, entire line of business applications up into the cloud so that you don't really rely as much on servers in your own back closet as you're relying on these servers that are cloud-based. Now, there are some considerations that we need to think about when we're talking about these cloud services. People's internet connections become much more important, so we've got to look at those, and we've got to know where our stuff is in the cloud if we can understand that. If we're in hurricane country and so is our cloud service provider, we both might still be impacted. But if we're working with good providers that are really doing everything they can to make sure their scenarios are robust, generally what they're doing is they're putting redundancy into their system. So if one area of the country is affected, another area just comes into play that is not affected and picks up the load and keeps everything running. So cloud services have really helped us out a lot through these new ways that we've had to kind of look at running our businesses. But again, we just need to kind of understand all the aspects of them as we kind of move in there. So again, if we pause for a second and give you a couple more key questions to kind of take away from these natural aspects of our disaster recovery planning, you just need to know, which natural disasters affect your business and which don't. And then as you look at those, have you judged the impact of each of those? So if you are in a part of the country that just gets blizzards in the winter, have you thought about those? Have you kind of planned it out and gamed out a plan for what happens if no one can make it into the office because all the highways are closed? And then the other thing that I find that almost no one does is write this down. Build a plan, build a document that's a living, breathing document that your employees are engaged in. So the time you spent doing the planning has resulted in an actual physical plan so that when something happens, there's a document people can turn to that they can get to that says, okay, here's what we do if someone comes in and we find out that they've got the coronavirus and everyone has to go remote, or here's what we do when we know that a blizzard is forecast for tomorrow and the governor has issued a stay-at-home order because of the severe weather, or here's what we do when a disaster is blowing up from the coast in terms of, in a hurricane and tornadoes and all that kind of thing. And just as important as it is to actually make a documented plan, it is extremely important to pull that plan out of the file cabinet every so often and have a look at that thing and make sure that it's current and you're keeping it updated, because things do change. So we've talked about the things that go wrong. Now let's talk about some aspects of the recovery planning that gets us, kind of helps us flesh out that plan. One of the questions that you need to answer is, how long can your business operate without the essential systems that you rely on? And this is going to be very unique to your business. We work with a lot of retail lumber yards, and in those cases during business hours when the doors are open, there's zero tolerance for down systems. We also work with people that are maybe in the light manufacturing or design, kind of engineering kinds of companies, and oftentimes they're not as impacted by the loss of a single server or an essential system for a longer period of time. So maybe they can go a half a day with the server down, where in that retail environment you can't have any downtime. So you need to be able to define how long your business can operate without your essential systems. And by doing that, you'll come up with what we refer to as our RTO, or recovery time objective. And so as you look at each important aspect of your network, your servers, your internet connections, your cloud services that you're getting access to, for each of those, if there is a significant loss of access to that system, you want to set some objectives for, okay, well, what's acceptable for getting that back? And here's why this is important, because the shorter the recovery time objective you set, you can kind of expect this little stack of money that goes along to put that in place gets a little bit taller. So there's a relationship. Short RTOs generally cost more than longer RTOs. So if you say, okay, well, if a server crashes and we want to make sure that we get a technician on site within 4 hours, that's generally the most expensive hardware plan. But if you have looked at your business and you've determined that, you know what, we could probably survive a day, maybe even 2 without that server, so we could put a slightly less expensive hardware maintenance plan in there by increasing the RTO or increasing that recovery time objective, giving us more time to respond to that event. You're going to spend less money up front building out the recovery mechanism. And again, as you're kind of balancing this stack of money versus this recovery time, you really should be looking at the operational costs that you have associated with this. And whenever I start talking about costs, people kind of jump to labor costs. Generally, they just go, well, we know what our labor cost is, but there are other costs that maybe aren't as easy to define a number on, but you should also be thinking about. And what I'm talking about there are other impacts to the business, like the lost business that happens when you're down. If you are servicing retail customers and you're down for a day, then you've lost all the walk-in business that you would have normally gotten. But also, if you're, let's say you're an engineering firm and you've got customers waiting for engineering plans to be delivered to them, and now you're suddenly a day late, you might even have contractual costs that go with that you've now missed a deadline. And another kind of fuzzy number that's a little bit more difficult to maybe put a number on is the reputational impacts of downtime and disasters to your business. I've found that people who have not planned well for a disaster often look kind of not as reliable to some of their vendors and their customers, and so the reputational impact of a downtime event becomes really significant. People go, look, you know what, we can't count on you to be here all the time, and we need to be able to keep our business going, so maybe we'll find another vendor to work with. And the flip side of that is the companies who have really done a great job of making sure that their systems are highly reliable and extremely redundant, and that downtime has been kind of factored out of the equation, are those who've gained some reputational value out of that effort. Customers go, look, we know we can always count on you to be there for us no matter what. So look at your operational costs, because again, what's going to happen is if you find that there are holes in your disaster recovery plans and you need to patch those holes, fill in some new solutions, there are going to be some fixed costs associated with that. And only when you understand the offsetting value of those can you really figure out if you're spending money properly. So the final set of key questions I'm going to ask you is, have you put your own proper values on your lost productivity or your lost sales, your reputational damage? Those are going to have to be numbers that your business comes up with based on the type of business you are. And based on those values, have you set the proper recovery time objectives for each of the major things we've talked about in here? So just glancing at the clock here, I see that we're up against our 30 minutes, so we'll wrap this up. Want to thank you for attending, and just as a reminder here, you see we've got our website URL listed at the bottom of the page there, www.appliedintegration.net. If you've missed the first webinar, we've got it linked up there. If you want to visit us next month when we do our business continuity webinar, which is kind of the next best part of this whole theme of backup and disaster recovery, that webinar, you'll be able to register for that there. We'll also be sending emails out to invite you to it. Thanks for joining us, and we'll talk to you next month.